Today's webinar is Charities, Elections and Advocacy. And just a word about the context. When we say advocacy today, we're talking about it in the context of public advocacy and elections as in the federal Australian context. And we're talking about charities, particularly charities. We know that there are a lot of not-for-profit groups out there that may not necessarily have charitable status, but our focus is on the charitable sector. The purpose being to enable charities to engage with the public at this really important time in our democratic system and to navigate the main legal issues relating to advocacy and elections with confidence, given the valuable contribution to policy and public debate that charity insights can bring. Now, I just want to note that the information is general in nature and should not be relied on as legal advice. It's such a context-specific environment. I'm really thrilled to introduce these three speakers, and I'll do them in order of the way they're going to present. So Kiera Peacock first. Kiera was a partner in the commercial litigation and administrative law team at Mark Lawyers before starting Ripple in the second half of 2024. Ripple specialises in political law, the law governing elections, campaigning and politics. With over a decade representing political candidates, parties, NGOs and advocacy organisations, Kiera has significant expertise navigating our electoral systems. And she's also acted in relation to electoral cases in courts and tribunals, including the Court of Disputed Returns, and is currently representing two Victorians who are challenging the constitutional validity of aspects of the Victorian donation laws. Our second speaker, Sam Loff, or Samantha Loff, is a member of the Herbert Smith Freehills charity law practice in Melbourne and specialises in advising and assisting charities and foundations. Sam assists charities with governance, compliance, tax and structuring for existing charities and foundations and for corporates and people wishing to set up a new charity or foundation. Our third speaker, Alex Milner, is a partner at Milner Huang and has practiced in the area of charity law for many years. I've worked alongside Alex in several roles, particularly when he was at World Vision Australia as an in-house counsel at Australian Red Cross too, and for a brief period, Alex worked with our team at Oxfam Australia. Alex also brings a wealth of experience across the range of laws affecting charities. So the sequence of our presentation today with these three fantastic speakers is to draw on their strengths and keep it practical. Kiera is going to speak about electoral law compliance first, followed by Sam, who will set the scene about advocacy and charitable purpose, and also touch on, in the case of some organisations, disqualifying purposes, some considerations and the analysis that people might wish to undertake at this time when the elections and advocacy collide. Alex is going to drill down into some more of the detail around charities like funding agreements, internal charity policies, delegations, and just touching on foreign influence as well. We do think we've allowed at least 10 minutes for questions at the end, and we just ask you to please pop them in the chat. And we'll come, I think the most orderly way to deal with that is to address the questions at the conclusion. But if you do have any concerns with accessing the technology or hearing, please let us know. I'd also be grateful if everyone would just make sure that their microphones are turned to mute so we don't have any background noise. Thanks, and I'll now ask Ian if he could put the slides up and we can turn to Kiera to present.
Thanks, Sari. Hi, everyone. Lovely to meet you, and thank you for taking some time out of what are no doubt very busy schedules at the moment. So yes, I work a lot with NGOs, various people engaging in the political process on understanding the electoral laws and working out how to comply with them. So what I think I do a bit of a run through today and a few key points to look out for in respect of authorising material, how to address disclosures, and also just being aware of the misleading conduct provisions in our Electoral Act. Next slide, please. Some of you may have been operating in different jurisdictions recently. There was obviously an election just in WA. Queensland was last year. So it's helpful just, I think, to remind everyone what is in and what's out of the federal electoral laws. So obviously the state-based laws do not apply to federal elections. So you just really need to focus on what's in the federal regime. The federal regime has authorisation requirements, which we'll address. There's some limited misleading conduct provisions which are in force at the moment because the writs have been issued. But it's primarily a disclosure-focused regime. There are currently no caps on expenditure, no caps on donations, no restrictions on where and how you can receive funds for use in the election. It really just looks at making sure that people disclose their electoral expenditure and the donations they use for that electoral expenditure. So you don't need to worry about all those other things like caps. You may have heard that the laws are going to change, and a couple of months ago, the government passed some very significant reforms to our electoral laws. They don't commence until the 1st of July 2026, so you don't need to worry about them for quite some time. And no doubt there'll be a fair bit of work getting up to speed with what they look like in that period. So just keep focused on what we've got this election, which is a relatively unintrusive regulatory framework. You do need to be, one thing which does affect charities is that you really shouldn't be using donations from foreign donors when you're incurring electoral expenditure. So making sure that you understand the source of funds that you're using to produce any pointed political content is very important to make sure you comply with those obligations and also be in a position to disclose amounts which you need to disclose in due course. And I'll take you through those various things in a bit more detail. Next slide, please. So the top of mind considerations for most people are when do I need to authorise something? And then when do I need to disclose what I'm spending and who I'm getting money from to incur that expenditure? Next slide. With the disclosure piece, and this also does factor into some of the authorisation requirements, but the only people who are caught by the Electoral Act are people who are what we call disclosure entities. So that's obviously your political parties and candidates. It's also third parties. Third parties are entities which spend between $16,900 this year and $250,000 on electoral expenditure. So organisations which are incurring, a decent amount of money on pointed political advertising or political spend, but not in that really top category. The top category is a significant third party. That's an entity which spends more than $250,000 in a year on electoral expenditure or primarily operates as a donor to political parties or candidates. So if you're ever thinking, do I need to disclose this amount? The first question is asking yourself, am I spending or am I likely to spend more than $16,900 on my political content and political advertising? If the answer is no, then you don't have any disclosure obligations under the Act. Do still recommend that you keep a track of anything which may fall in that category so that if you do need to reassess later on, you can do so. But those are the only people who are actually subject to the disclosure provisions of the law. And in the next slide, I'll explain how you assess. In a few slides later, I'll explain how you assess what electoral expenditure is and what electoral matter is. If you go to the next slide. The other thing I just wanted to break down, disclosure isn't a particularly scary thing. So don't be perturbed by the idea of disclosing amounts. There are plenty of charities that do become a disclosing entity and have done for a long period of time. I've just set out here a very brief summary of what it looks like if you are a disclosure entity. So if you're a third party, because you spent between, say, $17,000 and $250,000 on your electoral expenditure, in October of this year, you'd need to lodge a form which says, here's how much I spent on that content. Here are the donations above the disclosure threshold of $16,900, which I used to spend on that content. If you don't have any donations which are above that amount, then you don't need to disclose those donors. And so you submit that form, it gets published in February of next year. You don't need to register if you're in that category. So it's simply an after the fact disclosure lodgement with the AEC. If you are spending a lot of money because you're running a really, really strong campaign, then you may be a significant third party. What you actually have to disclose is similar to if you're a third party. A few key differences to bear in mind. One is that you actually do need to register during the course of the election. So at the point at which you pass that $250,000 threshold, you will need to register with the AEC. So keep that on your radar if your spending's creeping up towards that figure. You also need to remain registered for 3 years and lodge returns every year. So there is an ongoing compliance element to take into consideration. And your donors, so if you've received money from someone, say you received $20,000 from a donor to spend on your political expenditure, they need to also lodge a return which says any amounts they've used above the threshold to make that donation. So it has a kind of trailing effect. But that's for the really big spenders. Most organisations, if they are caught within this regime, will be a third party. And as I said, that's just a much simpler one. The charities, there are some exemptions in the Act which mean you only disclose the amounts you're spending on electoral expenditure or amounts you're receiving for electoral expenditure. You don't have to disclose kind of every dollar that comes into the organisation. So they do try to narrow it in that way. But I should mention that if you do, just say you got a donation of, say, $200,000 and you decided to use $20,000 of that to produce some electoral content, that would make, because you've used part of that one donation in a disclosable way, you would need to disclose the entirety of that donation. So I think that's why it is just good to keep front of mind, what am I looking to spend on electoral content? Where's the money coming from? What are the disclosure obligations that apply so that you can have that conversation with donors and they're not caught unawares if they are disclosed down the track, because obviously charities don't otherwise need to disclose those details. Go to the next slide. So all of these things rely on understanding what electoral matter and what electoral expenditure are. So I'll talk you through those definitions now. Electoral expenditure for anyone who is kind of not a party or candidate or significant third party has a relatively narrow definition, and that definition is money spent for the dominant purpose of creating or communicating electoral matter. If you go into one of those other categories of significant third party, campaign, candidate or party, then you have a broader definition, but let's work on the basis that most people would not be in that category. So it is, as I said, money spent for the dominant purpose of creating or communicating electoral matter. It's worthwhile just pausing on that, because as a threshold question, if you are looking to engage in an election, ask yourself, am I actually incurring discrete expenditure on this, on whatever I'm doing or producing? Or is it just actually general staff time that's producing the content? So if, for example, you've just got a team of comms people who are employed year round, and they are employed regardless of whether there's an election occurring, and that those people spend some time producing some electoral content, that does not make their salaries electoral expenditure, because their salary is not there for the dominant purpose of creating or communicating that electoral matter. If you brought in a contractor to produce electoral matter, then there is a chance that, depending on what else they're doing and what the purpose of that contract is, that the value of that contract may be electoral expenditure. Similarly, if you're just posting things organically on your social media accounts, and that it may be that there's no discrete cost behind that, and therefore there's no electoral expenditure. If you are paying to boost content, then it may be that boosting amount is electoral expenditure. So always ask yourself, is this just something that the organisation is doing within its usual resources, or am I actually incurring some discrete amounts? And then obviously electoral expenditure exists because it's communicating electoral matter. And so the question of what is electoral matter is very important. Electoral matter is matter communicated or intended to be communicated for the dominant purpose of influencing the way voters vote in a federal election, including by promoting or opposing a political entity So it's looking at what as the person communicating the matter, what are you intending to achieve by producing that content? Are you seeking to influence the way that people are voting? Or are you seeking to create awareness about certain policy matters? And there is a notation, which I forgot to put in the slides, but there's a notation in the Act that says material can only have one dominant purpose, and materials which are produced for the dominant purpose of creating awareness about an issue of policy or educating audiences will not necessarily be electoral matter, which is quite an important piece for charities, because a lot of what you engage in is policy awareness and education. So if you're looking at a particular piece of material, ask yourself first, what do I intend by this? Then look at, is it am I seeking to influence the way that people are voting, or is it more on this side of education and policy awareness? If you are, this is unlikely, but if you are expressly promoting or opposing a party or candidate in whatever you were saying, including if it's, this party is terrible for the environment or the like, which I know the others will probably speak to later from a charitable perspective, but from an electoral perspective, if that's what you're saying, that will attract a presumption that the material is electoral matter. And so worth bearing that in mind as well. But yeah, otherwise assess, what am I seeking to do? And then pop that through an objective filter as well. So I think it's one thing to say, well, I'm seeking to improve policy outcomes, but if you're handing out scorecards outside a polling booth, I think the primary purpose of that particular activity, even if it may be seeking to create awareness, is actually to encourage people to vote in a particular, with a particular issue in mind when they're entering that polling booth. If we go to the next slide, please. The importance of something being electoral expenditure or electoral matter, as I mentioned, is if it is electoral matter, it may need to be authorised, and I'll come to those requirements in a second. And if it's electoral expenditure, then you do need to track it to comply with your disclosure obligations down the track. If we pop to the next slide. Chart which has been commission, and it's a great way, I think, of identifying when matter needs to be authorised. So the fundamental is only material which contains electoral matter, that is matter for the dominant purpose of influencing how people vote in a federal election, needs to be authorised. If you are producing that type of content, then the questions you should ask yourself are, one, is it electoral matter and is it paid for? So is it boosted content? Is it a billboard? Is it a TV ad? If it's any of those, then yes, it needs to be authorised. Is it printed? If so, yes, it needs to be authorised. And then the final one, which is a little bit harder to navigate, is it electoral matter and am I a disclosing entity? So if you're a third party, a significant third party, then any material you produce, including on your organic social media, does need to be authorised. Whereas if you're not a third party, then strictly speaking, you don't need to authorise your organic socials. You only need to authorise those paid or printed materials. Having said that, the AEC certainly encourages people to authorise any material they're not certain about. There is, I think, a kind of a great policy argument as to why you might over-authorise material from a position of transparency around electoral and political communications. These laws haven't quite caught up with the way that people communicate, but if you do decide we're just going to authorise everything, that does not mean that you are saying everything is electoral matter. You're very much entitled to over-authorise and not have that be seen as an admission that the material was required to be authorised. But I think it does just do away with a lot of heartache if you pop an authorisation on your socials. If you are a disclosure entity and so therefore are required to authorise all of your content, I recommend taking a look at the AC website because it can get a little bit tricky in terms of how you authorize particular posts. So there's some good guides on there to help you navigate that. Big thing at the moment we also see is videos. So obviously people put up videos, it gets a lot of traction, and then if they haven't authorized those videos at the end of the video and they get asked to take it down, they lose all that kind of organic goodwill for the campaign. So that's another reason why, if you're in doubt about something, to authorize it, because it may be that at the time you post it, it's not electoral, but if you're sharing it a week or so before the election, it may be, and if you don't have that authorization, it can be difficult. So I think particularly for videos, pop an authorization on if you can. Next slide, please. Final thing I was just going to touch on is that we don't have truth in political advertising laws in Australia. So there is in effect nothing to stop people lying in political ads. So I do often get asked things like, how can this person say this? It's wrong and it shouldn't be allowed, and there's not a great deal we can do about it. The only provision we have is this one here, which says that a person during the period after the writs have been issued, so where we are now, shall not produce anything effectively which may be misleading or deceptive in relation to the casting of a vote. Now, that has a really narrow remit. It's not everything that's produced. It basically needs to affect the way that someone records the vote that they have decided to cast, rather than influence the way that they seek to vote. From your perspective, I'd say that if you are thinking about handing out scorecards at polling booths or producing anything that is being given to a person at the time they are casting their vote, just have a few people look at it from a few different lenses and make sure there's nothing about it that could, for example, risk someone recording an invalid or an informal vote but thinking it's valid. So it's not because anyone would be intending for that to occur, but just consider it. How might this be read by different people, different types of voters? And is there anything about it that could result, as I said, primarily in someone recording an invalid vote? Just go to the next slide. I can give you two examples of material which has been found to be misleading. The first one was signs put up in the 2019 election. The Court of Disputed Returns found that the sign to the left there, which said the correct way to vote is to put one next to Liberal, was misleading in the sense that it was designed to look like an AEC official sign rather than a party sign. It was produced by the Liberal Party, and that risked someone thinking that the actual instruction from the regulator was that they needed to vote in that particular way. So there was a risk they weren't actually recording the vote that they had formed. So that was found to be misleading. The ones on the right, they appeared in the 2022 election. There's been some earlier on in this cycle as well. These ones didn't go to court, but the AEC did say when this sign on the left started appearing outside polling booths, the court said, we think this is misleading now because it may result in someone thinking if they vote for David Pocock, they're voting for the Greens and vice versa. So it risks confusing how the votes were recorded. This is a fairly new developing area of law, so it's something just to be, as I said, to be mindful of. And that's a bit of a summary of the electoral law. So I might pass up to you, Sari, whether I answer one question in the chat or wait till the end.
If you have a minute, there is a question in the chat from Elizabeth about whether or not there's much case law on the meaning of electoral matter.
Yeah, so
it's a defined term.
There hasn't been much. There's one case, at least the last time I checked, which was from 2023, and that involved the AEC commencing action against Andrew Laming for failing to authorise some Facebook posts that he had posted not under his own name, but pretending to be a general member of the community. And so because of that, they weren't authorised, and some of them weren't promoting him. In that case, the court did take quite a particular view of each post. So, for example, Andrew Laming, so he was a politician, sorry, I should have said at the time. There was one post where he just posted like extracts from the Hansard, and the court found that that was not electoral matter. It wasn't necessarily promoting him. there were some others where he said Andrew's doing a really great job and how good's Andrew, and the court found that that was electoral matter. The interesting thing about that case is that the court looked at Andrew Laming didn't give evidence, so they couldn't actually get evidence from him about what his subjective intention was, but they did place a lot of emphasis on what the intention of the person producing the content is. So it does indicate you really need to understand what your intention is and how that might play out. And then there'll be some other things so that the court will then consider, such as like, is it talking about or how closely does it connect to an election? How closely does it connect to a promotion or opposition of a person in that election and the like as well? But yes, otherwise there is very scant judicial consideration of these provisions.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
Thanks for asking that great question, Elizabeth. And perhaps just to comment, Kiera, that might be because the Act at that time that was being interpreted did use the word intend to influence voters in an election rather than the dominant purpose wording that we've got. I know that there were earlier iterations of the legislation where you had to discuss intention. But thank you very much for that fantastic summary of the Act and the particular quirks with language. And we'll invite Sam to continue now. Thank you, Kiera.
Hey everyone, it's really great to be here, and you'll just be looking at my ugly mug for the next little bit because I don't have any slides, and I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about a separate but connected topic, which is around, so obviously Kiera just spoke about electoral law compliance and the kind of analysis, considerations, and record keeping that should be maintained in that context. And this is really going to be around ensuring charitable compliance and not straying into that kind of disqualifying purposes, political purpose territory. And this is going to be kind of like a broad setting of the scene and a really kind of high level practical consideration. I think all three of us, Alex, Kiera, and I, wanted this to be really practical and useful. So this is the kind of analysis that I take clients through when they're coming to me with these questions. And I think hopefully will be helpful. So of course, we're currently in a hotly contested election period, and I'm sure already I can recognize some names, even though many of you have just put your first names and I don't even know who you are, I can't see you, but I know that there are some people here that work in charities that also act for charities, and I'm sure you're already receiving and fielding questions. Can we talk about this policy? Is this tweet okay? Can we support this campaign? Is this crossing the line in terms of our charitable purposes? And so I guess the foundational question is, what is advocacy in this context? And of course, it can take many forms: online campaigns, social media posts, publishing articles, distributing flyers, blog posts, newsletters, protests, boycotts, letter writing, petitions. What all of these have in common, and I just want to, I guess, shout out the Commissioner's column today, which really spoke about this and provided that link to the really great guidance on the ACNC website. But what all of these have in common is that they are aiming to influence laws, policies, and decisions of government. And I'm not really going to go into the kind of analysis of the law because it's quite clear. In terms of the legal foundation, as has repeatedly been stated, most recently today by the Commissioner, advocacy for a charitable purpose is charitable. So that's great. That's good law. But there is a boundary to be mindful of, which can become particularly vexing during an election period like we're in now, which is that charities cannot have a disqualifying purpose, and most relevantly, the political purpose of promoting or opposing a political party or candidate for political office. So where's the line? And this is obviously we've seen this today even, that where a charities campaign is effective, like smart energy councils, politicians might accuse it of being political, even, and I'm not saying it is or it isn't to anyone listening, even if it's issues based and lawful. And, you know, of course, during this election period, tensions are high, scrutiny is intense, and this analysis can be really challenging to undertake and, you know, in my experience, a source of significant concern and fear for charities who really are very compliance focused and want to be, you know, doing the right thing. And I guess our intention is to really empower you, whether you're in a charity or working for charities, to enable your clients or your organizations to conduct advocacy for your charitable purposes confidently and lawfully and within the bounds of what's permitted. So because we're in this election campaign and there's this higher level of scrutiny, the analysis that I am going to step you through, which is, I think, probably an analysis to undertake for any kind of activity, but it's really, I guess, more heightened in this time, is considering your purposes and the risks involved, and then maintaining contemporaneous records of your analysis and conclusions. So, like with all things charity, we start with and come back to again and again and again, purposes. What are your charity's purposes? So, the advocacy that you might be conducting could be either directly in furtherance of your charitable purpose or ancillary to that purpose, for example, for retaining stakeholder relevance or public engagement. And we saw a lot of this type of advocacy, particularly during the referendum period, where many charities that didn't have purposes that had any relevance to the referendum itself or the topic of the referendum, commenting on it. And so in order to kind of assess your charitable purposes, you're looking at, of course, the objects in your charity's governing document, your charity subtype, which might itself be around advocacy for charitable purposes, but it might be environmental, cultural, education, health, welfare. You should also consider your DGR category if that's relevant. And as well as that, a picture of the charity's actual activities and programs. All of these together in a minestrone soup gives you a kind of holistic picture of what the charity exists to do and how the advocacy that you're considering might fit within that. You know, particularly because is the advocacy something that's really deviating from your day-to-day and what the charity ordinarily does, or is this squarely within what the charity does and exists for? And the analysis that we kind of consider is really using the governance standards as a compass. So asking the questions, is this activity being conducted for a proper purpose, for the charity's purpose? Is it in the best interests of the charity? And is the board acting with care and diligence in assessing whether the activity is consistent with or assists the charity in pursuing its purpose? Now, where the advocacy is directly relevant to the charitable purpose, this will be really much easier to express. For example, an environmental charity advocating for conservation, I pulled that from Sue's letter today, or a disability charity advocating for NDIS policies. But what about, for example, a cultural charity expressing support for the referendum, or a refugee charity speaking out about what's happening in Palestine? As we become more remote from the core purpose and the core activities of the charity, we start getting into, okay, we need to be applying a deeper level of scrutiny and consideration and analysis, as well as record keeping. So the board should be weighing up factors such as stakeholder expectations. So that could be public, that could be your beneficiaries, that could be your staff. Reputational risk, both the reputational risk of taking the action, but also the reputational risk of not taking the action. The ability to attract and retain staff, so what the expectations of your staff are. The short-term versus the long-term impacts. Would inaction undermine the charity's purpose or ability to fundraise, as well as resources? Will this campaign detract from the core work of the charity? Of course, resources is also a question. In fact, all of this is also a question for the electoral compliance perspective, but I'm talking about it more from the perspective of considering whether this is consistent with your charitable purposes. And of course, the further away, more remote, the more scrutiny and potential problems you're going to run into, particularly if it's on a topic that is hotly contested during the election. Then we come to keeping contemporaneous records. The board should be documenting its reasoning. While these records might hopefully never be needed, if the charity is challenged, it will show the analysis the board undertook in good faith and consistently with the governance standards. So what decision was made, what factors were considered, what information or advice was relied on, and what is the reasonable basis or evidence for making these decisions. The records should show why are you undertaking this event, campaign, or message, and tying it back to the charity's purpose. I'm always kind of harping on about this. What are your purposes and how does this link to it? And really considering, why are you doing this? Is it to influence a law or policy, to raise public awareness, to educate your audience, to generate public discussion on an issue, or to influence voters on how to vote in an election, which is also, it's a valid purpose for doing something, but being really clear about that is a really good start. It should also include the format, timing, and intended audience. Like Kiera was saying just before, if you're handing out something as someone's walking into a polling booth, what you're saying about it and why you're doing it is a really different analysis than if you're doing it 6 months out of the election and talking to folks at a farmer's market, for example. I'm going to wrap up now, but really obviously the safest path is to stay issues focused and keep coming back to the question, how does this further our charitable purpose? If the answer is clear and the records show that, you are in a strong position to conduct that advocacy. This isn't about avoiding risk altogether. It's about managing that risk, documenting it, and from my perspective, not shying away from public debate when it is sorely needed. That's it.
Thank you, Sam. That's so helpful, and I really like the note that was put in the link with the letter from the ACNC today. I like the title, Remember to Focus on the Issues, Not the Party Politics, in the sense that we used to say in organisations I've been involved with, play the issue, not the ball. Play the ball, not the player, so that you focus on the issue rather than the people and separate the politics and the purpose. Thanks, Sam. I don't think there is an immediate question for you, so if Alex is ready, we'll go straight to Alex.
Thank you. Thanks, Sari. I wanted to share with you some really practical tips, things that I've sort of a checklist that I've learnt from experience, which is just a euphemism for the collected wisdom of all my mistakes over time, that I would have found really helpful as an in-house lawyer. Some of these things are the obvious questions, but I can tell you that in the heat of the moment, when you've got people want to respond really quickly and get things out there in the context of an election campaign, often these questions get missed, or you assume the answer. Or alternatively, you've only got a very short window to actually work through them. So one of the key messages that I think, which is great, we see from the regulator, is that charities can conduct issues-based advocacy, and they can also, within limits, be involved in an election campaign. But not all charities are in that space. And if we can have the next slide. Even if the advocacy is consistent with the entity's charitable purpose, the constitution of the charity might impose additional limits. The one that I'm most familiar with is the Australian Red Cross Society's fundamental principles. One of those is neutrality. And this goes beyond not taking sides in a conflict. It also is about not engaging in any political controversies as well. So if you look at the way that Red Cross conducts advocacy, it's a lot. It's quite different in style, and that sort of infuses the whole organisation. I know there are some other organisations that sort of take a similar approach, but don't actually necessarily. I found it hard to find things in their constitutions. I did find one in the US, which has a curious thing that says that no substantial part of the activities of this corporation shall consist of carrying on propaganda or otherwise attempting to influence legislation. So if you have that in your constitution, you need to be mindful of it. And there's obviously a tax implication of that, because Section 5050, subsection 2 of the Income Tax Assessment Act 97 says that an income tax exempt entity must comply with all the substantive requirements in its governing rules. So there's a legal implication if you don't follow your constitution, as well as other implications. The other thing is, when someone's coming to you and wanting to do something, is checking the delegations of authority. Some organisations have really complicated delegations of authority, and there are specific limits around who within the organisation can authorise advocacy or advocacy during election campaigns. You need to be really mindful of that. Sometimes in some delegations of authority, the CEO or the management will be authorised to do certain things, but anything that doesn't fall within that authorisation sits back with the board, and you've got to be mindful of that. Even where you don't have you have a situation where management clearly has the delegated authority to make the decision, it's always good to maybe suggest to the C-suite that have you, the CEO, raised this with the chair? Has there been a discussion about this, so that the board's not blindsided? That's particularly the case if you've got a board that might be composed of people who are perhaps ex-ministers or otherwise have some sort of political connection. The next slide. The next step to drill down into is checking the internal policies you've got. Is there a policy around issues-based advocacy? Is there a board risk appetite statement? Those are helpful guides to use in that situation. Also, outside of the context of an election, it might be something to think about: should we have this in place? Should there be a board policy or a management policy if they've got the delegation to do that? The other thing to always be mindful of is that it's very common for advocacy campaigns to have a bolt-on fundraising ask. Now that simply might be just because the website has a link through to how you can get involved, and that includes a fundraising ask. Just be aware that the fundraising legislation, it's better than it was, but it's still broken, is probably the message. In states like New South Wales, the definition of what is a fundraising appeal is really, really quite vague, I think, and quite potentially very open-ended. So be aware that where you have a fundraising ask as part of the advocacy, you have to consider the fundraising rules. One thing that is quite an interesting provision in New South Wales is under the standard conditions of a fundraising authority, clause 6, there is a requirement that the charity ensure, the fundraiser ensure that the expenses of conducting the fundraising campaign are 50% or less than the likely proceeds of the appeal. Now, if you've got just a bolt-on fundraising ask on something that is really primarily something else, an advocacy campaign, just think about how that condition might impact what you're doing, and whether maybe if fundraising is just an afterthought, maybe take that off, so it's clear that what you've got is an advocacy campaign and not a fundraising appeal. If you've got any sort of collection of personal information, such as you're trying to get a petition together, you're trying to get people to sign up, support, be really mindful of the Privacy Act requirements. Is there a collection statement that goes with the advocacy campaign saying this is the purpose of the collection? Also be aware that sensitive information includes information or opinion about a person's political opinions, associations, or religious or philosophical beliefs. So it's quite possible, if you're doing that, you're getting someone to sign a petition, that actually what you're doing is collecting sensitive information, in which case the tighter restrictions under the Australian Privacy Principles will apply, in particular Australian Privacy Principle 6. Ian, next slide. You have to be mindful of where the funding for the activity is sourced. Is the funding subject to particular conditions or limitations on its use? And is the proposed advocacy in accordance with those conditions? Where you've got fundraising appeal proceeds, be mindful of what was the donor promise. and working out whether the advocacy that you're proposing is consistent with that donor promise. Donor promise might not be legally enforceable in some states. In some circumstances, a donation can create a trust, and so the donor promise can be enforceable that way. Be aware that Section 20 of the Charitable Fundraising Act in New South Wales, if you like, legislates donor promise by saying any money or benefit received in the course of a fundraising appeal is to be applied according to the objects or purposes represented to the donor. Also consider whether the activity is in compliance with contractual obligations to funders, including people that funders who may not be funding the particular activity but may have a contract with the charity. The Not-for-Profit Sector Freedom to Advocate Act is really useful in the Commonwealth context in preventing the Commonwealth and Commonwealth agencies from, if you like, gagging charities from advocating, but it only applies at the Commonwealth level. There's not a state or territory legislation that applies. And a lot of funding agreements contain what looks like an innocuous clause that says that the grantee must not do anything which brings the funder into disrepute. So just be aware that that can sometimes be used or could be used. Ian, next slide. Be especially mindful if the source of the funding of the proposed activity is from overseas, because there is the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Act. Broadly, the Act imposes obligations on persons that engage in foreign influence activities on behalf of foreign persons, which are defined generally as foreign governments or foreign political organisations. The Section 18 requires someone to register if they are undertaking activity on behalf of a foreign principal or enter into a registrable arrangement with a foreign principal. Now, I've got the definitions of both of those there. And the next slide. There is an exemption for ACNC registered charities, but the exemption is subject to conditions. So the activity has to be in pursuit of a charitable purpose within the Charities Act. The activity is not a disbursement activity, and I'll come back to that. And at the time that the activity is undertaken, both of the following matters are either apparent to the public or disclosed. One, the fact that the person is undertaking the activity on behalf of a foreign principal, and two, the identity of the foreign principal. So I mentioned before about disbursement activity. Disbursement activity is defined really unhelpfully. It says a person undertakes disbursement activity if the person disperses money or things of value, and there isn't a requirement to disclose that under the Commonwealth Electoral Act. Now, most charities and advocacy campaigns don't disperse money, but it's quite a common practice to publish a report and then have a media release or series of speeches that relate to a report. Now, the report could be a thing of value. So just be mindful of that. There are other exemptions under the Transparency Scheme Act. One is in connection with humanitarian aid, and the other is in relation to religious activity. I'll let you look at those. Just the next slide, please. Finally, just a couple of things that to keep in mind. There is a particularly difficult situation to manage if you've got a staff member who wants to be directly involved in a political campaign or wants to stand for office. And again, think about whether you've got a good internal process and policy around that. And also just be aware of the limits of an employer's ability to give an employee reasonable directions. There's always going to be limits of how reasonable it is to direct someone outside of work, what they do on the weekends, and also whether there is a discrimination, particularly if only the Greens candidates get directed to do things as opposed to the Liberal Party candidates, that sort of thing. Be aware where you've got an online element to the advocacy campaign that things can get away from you very quickly. What do you do if your supporters start putting a whole series of comments on your charity's webpage or your website? How are you going to manage that? What do you do if politicians respond to what you do and accuse you of playing politics? How are you going to manage that? And finally, if there is a public event involved, think through what the speakers might, who are the speakers, what might they say. If there are children there, be mindful of safeguarding, and also think about insurance as well. But that's finally just there are some really useful links. The ACNC's commissioner's column is not up on that list, but the link to the ACNC guidance is there. There's some really helpful guidance on the Human Rights Law Centre at that link. And finally, if you want to read more about a particular type of advocacy, Matthew Harding's recent book is really interesting too. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Alex, for that contribution. All those practical tips resonated very strongly. And I'd just like to thank all the speakers, Samantha, Kiera as well. I think you've really covered what can, from the outside, if you're a newcomer to the sector and you just suddenly arrive at an election period, it can be quite like a maze and bamboozling, and you've provided some very clear and practical navigation through the system. Ian, do we have any questions that people have raised? I see a comment from Claire Carton, one of our past board members, thanking you all as well for your contribution.
Any questions in the chat, Sari?
Okay.
I do have a question if you're looking for questions at the moment.
I'm happy to take questions. If anyone, I'm just going through the participants to see if there are hands up, but please put your hand up if you would like to ask a question. But Ian, you go now.
I'm just going to ask, and it's maybe more directed at Alex, but just sort of thinking about charities working in groups or in conjunction with many charities overseas, if you sort of think about Global Citizen or the Hunger Project and so on. How do those charities sort of manage that grouping with a whole range of overseas affiliates in terms of, I guess, particularly the foreign influence transparency legislation, but sort of more broadly with how they sort of handle their activities during an election campaign?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So the foreign influence transparency scheme probably won't pick up those arrangements because the foreign principal won't be a government entity or an entity which has a predominantly political purpose, but it could do. And there certainly have been situations where overseas charities have funded campaigns in Australia, and obviously that was something to be mindful of. Also, there might be things which people don't initially think of, but if you have funding from, let's say, the New Zealand Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Trade, MFAT, well, that would get picked up. So that's something to be mindful of. Look, those kind of broader coalitions and broader arrangements within confederations of charities, there is a whole infrastructure to manage those and to make sure it stays on message. They obviously can be actually quite difficult because of the numbers of people involved. There are also some things that are really beneficial of them because sometimes they allow if you like, the coalition, however it's branded, to make the point, and rather than the charities use their names directly. So it can be really useful that way. There's also something where sometimes it is good to publish a report internationally, and then the local charity reports the news. And so what it's doing is it's relying on certain exemptions under the Copyright Act. So there can be some benefits, but it's also a challenge, I suppose, as you can imagine.
Thanks, Alex. I'm going to just cut in here because we do have a couple of questions in the chat, which I'd like to get to before we run out of time. But thanks for that great question and your answer, Alex. The question in the chat from Paul is there a sense that the ACNC could take action in respect of any charities who engage in political advocacy, noting that he doesn't recall any actual action occurring previously? Would anyone like to field that? If you've read the ACNC guide, you'll see that they do have a little link on there about concerns about a charity's activities, and they certainly direct people to the guide, read the guide first and check our resources, but contact us if you still have concerns. But is there any comment from Sam, Kiera, or you, Alex?
I guess I've also seen Mark's question. I think that they're in some ways similar, related questions, which is that engaging in the political process doesn't necessarily mean that you have a disqualifying political purpose. And if the ACNC considers that you have a purpose of promoting or opposing a political party or candidate for office, then it could, of course, conduct an investigation to suggest that you have a disqualifying political purpose. But not any political advocacy is going to meet that criteria. And I think that it's going to have to be something quite explicit and overt and, red flag, 5 alarm, in order for the ACNC to investigate and take any action in respect of political advocacy, particularly where the charity has demonstrated how and why it is undertaking that advocacy in furtherance of its purpose.
Thank you, Sam. And just for people who might look at this recording later, the question in the chat was about the Commissioner's current tax ruling, TR 2011 number 4, and the explanatory memorandum 1.110A around activities of a charity during an election. I don't think there are any other questions for now, and we've come to the top of the hour, so I just want to confirm there was a question about whether the recording will be provided to all those who registered, and it will be. But again, thank you sincerely, Sam, Kiera and Alex. It's just great to have access to professional advisors with deep interest in this space. I think it's been an unparalleled in terms of breadth and applicability to our charity sector specifically. So thank you so much on behalf of CLAANZ, and thank you to all our attendees who registered.